The case did not end in the courtroom. It ended in a file drop. Before the plea, the court tried to control the atmosphere around the case. A standing decorum order was issued to restrict activity in and around the courthouse. It barred interviews inside court buildings. It restricted photography, recording, and broadcasting in designated areas. The message was clear. This would not become a live stage. But the courthouse could only control what happened inside its walls. Outside those walls, the record was becoming the next battlefield. Not because it could change the outcome, because it could change the audience. In October of 2018, even before sentencing, the coroner filed a petition asking the court to seal the autopsy reports. The argument was that public release could damage the fairness of a future trial. Media organizations fought for access. A judge later denied a request to block release of the autopsy reports, and the dispute itself became part of the story. It was the system admitting a problem it cannot solve cleanly. A tragedy can be public. The details do not have to be. Then the plea arrived and removed the reason for some secrecy. A plea eliminates a jury. A plea eliminates the risk of jury prejudice. A plea also leaves the public with an emptier kind of ending. No trial means no full narrative delivered in one place. No cross-examination. No long structured testimony. No single moment where the case is spoken out loud from beginning to end. So the public went hunting for the missing narrative. On November 21, 2018, the Weld County District Attorney's Office released more than 2,000 pages of documents in response to a Colorado Criminal Justice Records request. The timing was not accidental. It came days after sentencing. It arrived exactly when the world was still watching, but the courtroom was no longer producing content. Those pages became the new episode. They were not written like a documentary. They were written like an investigation. They were a pile of timelines, interviews, screenshots, and fragments. Police notes, agent summaries, witness statements, phone extractions, threads of text messages that were never meant to be read by strangers. The effect was immediate. A case that had already reached legal finality suddenly felt active again. Because it felt like new information, even though it was only newly released information. And in true crime culture, newly released and new are treated the same. People began reading the marriage like evidence. They did not read the texts as two people talking in private. They read them like clues. They pulled lines out of context. They built arguments about who was right, who was wrong, who was manipulative, who was cold. They treated normal human messiness like courtroom proof. The file also contained the detail that many suspected but could not prove early. He was having an affair. Once that detail entered the public archive, it became a narrative lever. The internet used it to simplify motive into something that can be summarized in one sentence. A new relationship. A desire to start over. A desire to erase the old life instead of leaving it. Then the archive did what archives do in the modern world. It multiplied. The documents were copied. They were mirrored. They were turned into videos and threads and annotated screenshots. Creators learned that reading a police report out loud is content. They learned that a text message on screen can be a scene. They learned that the public will watch the same material again if you add a new tone, a new title, and the promise of a missing piece. That is how the case became renewable. A renewable case does not need new facts. It needs a steady supply of material that can be repackaged. A renewable case does not need a new trial. It needs a new upload. This is why the district attorney's office eventually created a dedicated page to streamline records requests for the Watts case. The page treated the archive like a logistics problem. It warned that the files are very large. It provided a procedure for requests under Colorado Open Records and criminal justice records laws. It was not a press release. It was infrastructure. It was the system adapting to the fact that a murder file had become global demand. The public likes to imagine that document access is neutral. It is not neutral. Access creates ownership. Ownership creates entitlement. Entitlement creates harm. The same documents that helped investigators build probable cause became tools for strangers to build accusations. Not against the man who confessed and was sentenced. Against the people still alive. The archive became a weapon because it was large enough to be mined selectively. A person could pull one line and ignore the next page. A person could frame a text as sinister. A person could read routine conflict as a hidden plot. The record did not have to be falsified to be used dishonestly. It only had to be edited. That is the modern afterlife. A case ends in court. The story restarts in documents. The documents become content. The content becomes a market. The market rewards anyone who promises a new angle. The court tried to keep decorum inside the building. The internet built a stage outside the building. And once the story became downloadable, it became permanent. Not because the facts changed, because the audience kept changing. A new viewer arrives. A new viewer wants the full file. A new viewer turns private messages into public property. A new viewer repeats the cycle. A trial would have ended with one coherent narrative told under rules. The plea ended with a sentence. The archive supplied the missing narrative without rules. And once the case became an archive, the world stopped asking when it would end. The world started asking what else could be extracted from it. Before the plea deal, the courthouse was already fighting a second case. Not the murder case. The information case. The judge issued a standing decorum order because the building was not a theater and the process could not survive as one. It restricted electronic devices inside designated areas. It barred interviews inside the court buildings. It barred photography, recording, and transmission inside those spaces. The goal was not secrecy. The goal was control. At the same time, the defense claimed the control was already broken. In late August of 2018, defense attorneys asked for an investigation into leaks to the press. They argued that unnamed sources close to the investigation were putting out details that could poison a future jury pool. A judge denied the request, saying the defense had not shown prejudice or a clear violation, but the ruling still acknowledged the problem. It recognized that a Frederick police source story, if accurate, would be the kind of statement the court does not allow. So the case sat inside a contradiction. The court tried to keep the proceedings clean. The public tried to pull the story into the open before the process was ready. And the media environment rewarded speed more than restraint. Then the plea deal removed the trial. And when the trial disappears, the hunger does not. It simply changes targets. Because a trial would have produced one controlled narrative under rules. A plea produces a sentence and silence. So the story moved to the next available fuel. Documents. On November 21, 2018, the Weld County District Attorney's Office released more than 2,000 pages of investigative material in response to criminal justice records requests. The release was not a cinematic reveal. It was an administrative decision under public records pressure. But the impact was cinematic anyway. It created a new form of access. It let people read the marriage backward. It let people treat texts like evidence of destiny. It let strangers argue motive with the confidence of ownership. And that release did not end the stream. In the days that followed, more material arrived through additional releases. Interviews, interrogation footage, search warrant returns, pieces of the investigation that would normally be understood inside a courtroom framework. Without a trial, the framework was gone. Viewers did not receive evidence. They received raw materials. And raw materials are dangerous in the hands of an audience that wants a clean villain and a clean motive. A courtroom asks, what can be proven? The internet asks, what can be interpreted? This is how the narrative kept moving even though the legal case was over. Not through new charges, through new releases. The district attorney's office eventually created a dedicated page to manage ongoing requests for Watts case materials. That page is quiet, procedural, and almost sterile. But it says something important without meaning to. It shows that the case turned into infrastructure. It created a permanent administrative burden. It forced the system to build a pipeline for the public's demand. And the demand did not remain local. Federal records exist too. The FBI vault hosts a file set for the Shannon Watts murder investigation, released in a format that looks like a catalog entry, not a headline. It is the same story repeating in a new container. Local court orders, local leak disputes, local open records releases, and then over time, national archives. That is the afterlife of a famous crime in the digital era. The murder ends. The prosecution ends. The sentence is final. But the file does not end. The file becomes a second crime scene. A place where millions of people return, not to solve anything, but to touch the evidence with their eyes. And once a case becomes a file that can be downloaded, clipped, and re-uploaded, it stops being a single event. It becomes a loop. And the loop does not ask whether the victims ever wanted to be turned into an archive. It only asks what else can be opened next. After the state case closed, the record did not stop expanding. It changed jurisdiction. The first record was local. Police reports, search warrants, interview summaries, the kind of paperwork that lives in county servers and court folders. Then a second record appeared in the Federal Archive. The FBI vault hosts a public entry titled Shannon Watts Murder Investigation. The entry points to a single large PDF file. It is not a press conference. It is not a documentary. It is an upload. This is the quiet way a case becomes permanent. Not through a new hearing, through a new repository. But the Federal Archive has its own rules. The Vault Index warns that when files are voluminous, only summaries or excerpts may be posted online. That means the public does not receive the whole file simply because a title exists. The public receives what survives process, redaction, and policy. The existence of a vault entry signals something else too. It signals that years after the murders, someone was still filing requests, still asking for records, still trying to pull more material out of the system. A federal FOIA log for 2023 includes an entry for the murder of Shannon Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts, with a date opened of August 22, 2022. That date matters. It proves the timeline of demand. It proves the afterlife did not fade. It continued. This is how modern true crime stays alive. Not because the facts are moving. Because access is moving. A new request produces a new release. A new release produces a new wave of viewers. A new wave of viewers creates a new market for interpretation. The law that governs access is different at each level. In Colorado, most government records fall under the Colorado Open Records Act. But criminal justice records are handled under a separate law, the Colorado Criminal Justice Records Act. That difference is not academic. It decides what an agency must release, what it may release, and what it can refuse. The Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition explains that CCJRA governs criminal justice agencies such as police departments, district attorneys, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. That framework gives custodians discretion, especially for investigative files. It also creates a reality where the public is not simply reading a record. The public is negotiating with gatekeepers. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation makes this explicit on its own public records request page. It tells the public what categories exist, what processes apply, and what is not treated the same way as ordinary government paperwork. The Weld County District Attorney's Office built an even more direct pipeline in the Watts case. It created a dedicated page telling the public how to request access to materials released in the investigation. A form, a submission process, a controlled channel for an uncontrolled appetite. This is what a famous case does to a legal system. It turns an investigation into infrastructure. And once the infrastructure exists, the public begins to treat it like a service. People do not ask, should this be public? They ask, where is the link? They ask, where is the next file? They ask, what else is being held back? That mindset creates a dangerous illusion. It creates the illusion that the public is entitled to completeness. But completeness is not the system's goal. The system's goal is prosecution. Once prosecution ends, disclosure becomes a separate question. Disclosure becomes a balancing act. Privacy, fairness, victim dignity, public interest, institutional caution, administrative workload, all of it stacked on top of a file that was never designed to be consumed as entertainment. This is why the case keeps looping. The court delivered finality. 3 life sentences. No parole. No appeal drama that reshapes the verdict. The internet rejected finality because finality is not content. So the attention moved to what could still be extracted. Timelines, text messages, body camera footage, interviews, transcripts, redactions, metadata, anything that looks like a missing piece. And the federal layer adds a new kind of temptation. Because a federal archive feels like a deeper vault. It feels like a hidden room inside the same story. It invites the audience to believe there must be something else inside. Most of the time, the something else is not a new truth. It is the same truth in a different format. It is the same story told in reports instead of headlines. It is the same events described by agents instead of anchors. But the audience does not process it that way. The audience treats new format as new fact. That is how a closed case becomes a permanent machine. A request is filed. A release is posted. A PDF becomes a new episode. A new narrator reads it aloud. A new audience arrives, convinced it is seeing behind the curtain. And behind every curtain is the same fixed reality. The murders happened. The confession happened. The bodies were recovered. The sentence was imposed. The only thing still moving is access. And access has its own momentum. It does not require new crime. It does not require new evidence. It only requires another person, years later, deciding they want the file in their hands. That is the true afterlife of this case. A courthouse ending. A digital beginning. And once the story lives in systems designed for retrieval, not closure. It becomes easier to pull the record back into the light than it is to let it finally go dark. By the time the case entered the Federal Archive, the story had learned a new language. The language was black ink and missing lines. In the FBI vault, the Watts investigation appears as a titled entry and a single large file. It looks simple. It looks like closure. It looks like the government placing the case on a shelf where it can be reached. But a vault upload is not a full window. It is a controlled release. A controlled release is built around one principle. The public may see what can be shown. The public may not see what can cause harm. That is why the pages arrive with redactions. A redaction is not only a privacy choice. A redaction is also a legal code. In federal FOIA practice, privacy protection is one of the most common reasons information disappears. Exemption 6 exists to prevent a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy in personnel, medical, or similar files. Exemption 7(c) exists to protect personal privacy in records compiled for law enforcement purposes. Those definitions sound abstract until you imagine what a homicide file contains. A homicide file contains names and phone numbers of witnesses who never wanted fame. A homicide file contains addresses and dates of birth. A homicide file contains medical details. A homicide file contains photographs and descriptions that turn the dead into inventory. A homicide file contains investigative methods that agencies do not want reproduced by people who would learn how to evade them. So the file is processed like a battlefield. A line is released. A line is blocked. A paragraph survives. A paragraph becomes a rectangle of black. And the black rectangles create the most dangerous illusion in modern true crime. They make the audience feel that something is being hidden. The audience does not see privacy protection. The audience sees a secret. That misunderstanding is how a file becomes fuel for conspiracy. A viewer points at the black bar and asks what it covers. Another viewer claims to know. A creator builds a video around the missing text and calls it a cover-up. A comment section fills the gap with imagination. The law never intended those bars to function as a plot device. But online they do. The FBI also warns in its own public explanations of FOIA processing that records may be withheld or partially withheld under exemptions, and that appeals exist as a separate step. It is a bureaucratic system meant to balance access and protection. It is not designed to satisfy an audience. So the system produces what it is designed to produce. Process pages. Exemption codes. A record that is both present and incomplete. Then a second fact deepens the afterlife. The record exists because the requests do not stop. A FOIA log entry shows a request titled for the murder of Shannon Watts and the two girls, with a date opened in August of 2022. That date comes years after sentencing. It proves that the case was still being pulled back into the light by strangers who were not part of the original prosecution. This is how an archive stays alive. Not through new evidence. Through repeated demand. Demand creates paperwork. Paperwork creates releases. Releases create new content. And every release changes the audience again. A person who watched a documentary might become a person who wants the file. A person who reads the file might become a person who wants the parts that were removed. A person who sees black bars might become a person who starts believing the black bars are the real story. This is where the federal layer becomes seductive. A county file feels local. A county file feels complete enough to close the basic questions. A federal file feels deeper. It feels like an inner room. That feeling is often wrong. Most of the time, a federal file is the same reality described through a different agency's format. It is still interviews. It is still summaries. It is still the same fixed events. But the audience does not reward sameness. The audience rewards the belief that a deeper secret exists. So the archive becomes a ladder. Each rung is a new source, a new upload, a new PDF, a new log entry, a new piece of metadata. The viewer climbs the ladder expecting revelation. The viewer usually finds repetition. That repetition is the most unbearable truth for the audience and the most comforting truth for the legal record. The facts do not change. Only the containers change. The murders remain what they were. The confession remains what it was. The recoveries remain what they were. The sentence remains what it is. But the public cannot accept a story with no remaining movement. So it treats access as movement. The system becomes a machine that produces the sensation of progress without producing any new resolution. A request is opened. A file is processed. A page is redacted. A video is made. A new audience arrives. A new request is filed. This loop has a final cruelty that is easy to miss. Every time the file is reopened as entertainment, the victims are reopened too. The names are repeated. The faces are displayed. The private messages are read aloud. The last days are replayed, as if repetition makes them understandable. The public calls this interest. The family experiences it as invasion. FOIA was built to make government accountable. FOIA was not built to turn homicide files into a subscription model. But the modern internet does not respect that boundary. It treats the file as a product because a product can be consumed. It treats redactions as a mystery because mystery holds attention. It treats privacy as a problem because privacy blocks the next upload. So the case keeps living in the only way a digital era case can live forever. It lives as an archive that never satisfies the hunger it feeds. The court gave the final ending. A life sentence without parole is the end that law can deliver. The archive gives a different ending. It gives a perpetual beginning. It gives the audience a reason to believe that if they download one more file, the story will finally make sense. It gives creators a reason to promise that one more page will change everything. It gives strangers a reason to keep searching. And the truth remains unchanged, waiting behind the noise. The only thing that keeps moving is access. Access turns grief into a renewable resource. Access turns black bars into rumors. Access turns a closed case into a living market. That is what a federal vault entry really represents in the afterlife of this story. It is not a new chapter. It is a new place where the same tragedy can be reopened again, under a different seal, for a different audience, with the same outcome every time. In a famous case, a government file does not feel like paperwork. It feels like a door. The federal entry looks clean on the surface. A title, a single PDF, a promise that if you open it, you will see what the system saw. But what you receive is not a full window. What you receive is a processed view. Every page has been decided. Every line has been weighed. Every name has been treated as a potential hazard. That is what a federal release actually is. It is not a reveal. It is a negotiation between transparency and protection. The public hears the word transparency and assumes completeness. The system hears the word transparency and thinks in exemptions. Exemptions are the quiet machinery of modern obsession. They are the reason the page has black bars. They are the reason some paragraphs end mid-thought. They are the reason the most sensitive details appear as absence. In federal practice, privacy is one of the most common reasons information disappears. The logic is not complicated. A homicide file contains more than crime. It contains the private lives of people who did not choose to be famous. A file contains witnesses who gave statements in fear. A file contains phone numbers and addresses. A file contains medical facts. A file contains descriptions that should never be read for entertainment. A file contains the kind of details that turn a human being into an inventory list. The system removes those details because the law allows removal. The law treats privacy as a real interest, even when the public interest is high. But the Internet does not interpret a redaction as protection. The Internet interprets a redaction as a clue. A black bar becomes a blank space the audience feels entitled to fill. A blank space becomes rumor. Rumor becomes content. Content becomes an accusation. This is the most dangerous transformation in true crime culture. The transformation of restraint into suspicion. A careful system tries to prevent further harm. A hungry audience reads that prevention as proof of something hidden. Then creators step in and sell certainty. They point to the missing lines and say they know what is there. They make the black bar feel like a secret. They make the secret feel like a cover-up. They make the cover-up feel like a reason to keep watching. None of that requires new evidence. It requires only a gap. The gap is not accidental. It is produced by policy. It is produced by law. It is produced by the simple fact that a government file is not a public diary. The Federal Archive also creates another illusion. It makes people believe the real story must be deeper because it is federal. A county file feels local. A county file feels like the full scene. A federal file feels like an inner chamber. Most of the time, the inner chamber is the same reality described in a different voice. It is still interviews. It is still summaries. It is still the same fixed events. The format changes, and people call the change a revelation. That is why the FBI vault entry matters, even when it contains no new crime. It matters because it restarts attention. It tells the audience there is another place to search. It tells the audience there is another file to open. It tells the audience the case can be reopened without anyone in a courtroom saying a word. The clearest proof that the case stays alive is not a documentary. It is a log. A federal FOIA log shows that a request tied to the murders was opened in August of 2022. That is years after the guilty plea. Years after sentencing. Years after the public claimed it was finished. The date is the point. It proves the demand does not fade. It only changes hands. One viewer becomes the next requester. One requester becomes the next uploader. One uploader becomes the next narrator. The file becomes a relay baton passed across years. This is how a closed case keeps behaving like a living thing. Not through new violence. Through repeated access. Access also changes what people believe they are entitled to. A public record request becomes a habit. A habit becomes a right in the mind of the audience. A right becomes anger when the system says no. The system says no for reasons the audience does not want to hear. The system says no because the dead still deserve dignity. The system says no because the living still deserve privacy. The system says no because a file can contain information that would create new harm if it spread. The audience hears no and assumes the no is hiding a twist. Then the case loops back down from federal to local again. In Colorado, the record has its own pipeline. The district attorney's office built a dedicated process for the Watts case because the requests never stopped. The page warns that the files are very large. It offers a paid USB option for people without high-speed internet. It treats the archive like a logistics problem. That detail matters because it shows scale. A homicide case forced an agency to build infrastructure for strangers. Infrastructure changes behavior. When the file becomes easy to request, it becomes easy to consume. When it becomes easy to consume, it becomes easy to monetize. When it becomes easy to monetize, it becomes hard to stop. Then the story takes its cruelest turn. The more material the public can access, the more the public treats the victim's lives as public property. Private texts become scenes. Family photos become exhibits. Medical details become talking points. The ordinary conflicts of a marriage become evidence in arguments that strangers use to judge a dead woman. People call this analysis. The family experiences it as invasion. FOIA was built for accountability. It was built so the public can question power and see how government acts. It was not built to turn murder files into subscription content. But the modern internet converts function into entertainment. It turns accountability tools into content tools. It turns redactions into hooks. It turns privacy into a conspiracy. It turns dignity into an obstacle. So the case becomes permanent in the most modern way possible. A court closes the criminal chapter. An archive opens the cultural chapter. The archive does not resolve anything. It only supplies raw material. Raw material keeps the case active. It keeps the case profitable. It keeps the case circulating. And it keeps the survivors trapped inside a story they did not choose to share with the world. That is what the federal vault entry and the local records pipeline represent together. They represent a case that cannot be retried, but can be replayed. They represent a system trying to balance public access with private harm. They represent a culture that treats every barrier as proof of a hidden room. The ending the law delivered was final. 3 life sentences without parole. A door that will never open. The ending the archive delivers is different. It delivers endless beginnings. One more file. One more upload. One more thread. One more narrator promising that the missing lines contain the real truth. And every time that promise is made, the case is reopened again. Not in a courtroom. In the minds of strangers who believe access is the same thing as permission. At some point, every audience asks the same question. Why? Not because the answer can undo anything, but because the mind cannot tolerate a horror that has no shape. So people try to give it a shape. They reach for a label that feels like control. Researchers have a label. They call it familicide or family annihilation. It is the kind of event that makes headlines because it is extreme, but it is also the kind of event that is rare enough to feel unreal until it happens in a place that looks like any other neighborhood. Content reference suicide, 0 index equals 0. When the National Institute of Justice gathered researchers to discuss these crimes, one point landed with unusual clarity. In homicide-suicide cases, intimate partner violence often exists long before the final act, and it is frequently invisible in official records. In one study discussed at that forum, prior intimate partner violence was found in 70% of cases, while only a fraction appeared in arrest records. The violence was real, but the paper trail was thin. Content reference suicide, 1 index equals 1. This is one reason the public keeps getting surprised. People imagine danger announces itself. Often it does not. It hides in private routines, private fear, private control. Researchers have also tried to map motive, not to excuse it, but to understand its pattern. In a peer-reviewed study published in the Howard Journal of Criminal Justice, the authors proposed a taxonomy with 4 types of family annihilator: self-righteous, disappointed, anomic, paranoid, content reference suicide, 2 index equals 2. The words sound clinical, but they describe a human impulse that is anything but clinical. Control. In that taxonomy, the self-righteous offender pushes blame onto the partner and frames the crime as punishment. The disappointed offender believes the family failed to live up to his ideal. The anomic offender treats the family as a status symbol and reacts to collapse as if the family has become surplus. The paranoid offender convinces himself he is protecting the family from an outside threat. Different stories, same conclusion. A man makes his family the object of his own crisis. Content reference suicide, 3 index equals 3. The public loves these categories because they feel like an explanation. But categories are not closure. They are only a lens. They help us recognize patterns. They do not create a reason that makes the outcome bearable. And they can become dangerous when people use them as a weapon. Because once a category exists, people start forcing a case into it. They start treating a dead woman like a character who must fit a role. They start treating children like props in an argument about motive. They start confusing analysis with ownership. That is where the Watts case becomes a mirror, not only of what happened, but of what the public does afterward. The record gave the audience the illusion of authority. It gave people texts, timelines, interviews, and footage. It invited the belief that if you read enough pages, you can find the single sentence that explains everything. But research does not offer a single sentence. It offers risk factors, and it offers limits. The NIJ Forum discussion points to risk factors that appear again and again in homicide-suicide and severe domestic violence cases. Prior domestic violence, estrangement, threats with a weapon, access to a gun, signals that a relationship is breaking and a person who cannot accept the break. Content reference suicide, 4 index equals 4. Even those factors are not prophecy. They are not a prediction that a particular man will kill. They are a warning that control and violence often escalate when someone believes they are losing a life they think belongs to them. So the real lesson is not a checklist. The real lesson is humility. A file can tell you what happened. A taxonomy can tell you what it resembles. Neither one gives you permission to turn victims into content. And the system can feel that pressure. It has to manage it. That is why the Weld County District Attorney's Office built a dedicated process for records requests in this case, and why it warns that the files are very large. It even offers a paid USB option for people without high-speed internet, as if a murder investigation became a product that needs shipping. Content reference suicide, 5 index equals 5. This is the point where the case stops being only a crime and becomes a permanent archive. And once an archive exists, the audience keeps asking for the next release, the next interview, the next page. Because a category is never enough. A sentence is never enough. A confession is never enough. The hunger is not really for facts. It is for a story that finally feels finished. And this story will never feel finished to the people who need an explanation more than they need the truth. When people ask why, they usually mean something simpler. They mean, what could make a person do this? They mean, what would stop it? They mean, how do we recognize it before it happens? Research does not give a single satisfying answer. It gives patterns and probabilities. It gives risk factors and warning signs. It gives a vocabulary for behaviors that many families live with long before anyone calls it danger. One word researchers use is familicide. It refers to the killing of multiple family members, most commonly an intimate partner and at least one child. It sits at the overlap of intimate partner homicide and child homicide. It is not a new kind of violence. It is the most concentrated expression of control, entitlement, and collapse. One reason these crimes feel impossible is that they often come wrapped in normal life. A job, a mortgage, a neighborhood that looks safe, a family that looks ordinary on camera. That normal surface is not evidence of safety. It is a mask that can exist even when private dynamics are deteriorating. The National Institute of Justice has summarized research on family murder followed by suicide and the risk factors that show up repeatedly in those cases. The strongest risk factor discussed is prior domestic violence. Other factors include access to a gun, threats with a weapon, estrangement, and the presence of a stepchild in the home. The same research notes something the public often gets wrong. A past criminal history is not a reliable predictor. Many perpetrators do not look dangerous on paper until the day they are. This is the point where people try to push the Watts case into a neat box. They want a clean motive that makes the act feel explainable. They want the affair to be the key. They want money to be the key. They want resentment to be the key. A key is comforting. A key implies a lock that could have been secured. But real cases do not obey that kind of storytelling. The NIJ work emphasizes that communities search for explanations after these crimes, and that the search often turns toward financial stress or other visible pressures. Visible pressures matter, but they can also distract. They can make people ignore what is harder to name. The private pattern of domination. The private fear. The private rules inside a relationship. That is why modern domestic violence research emphasizes behavior that may not leave bruises. The CDC describes intimate partner violence as abuse or aggression in a romantic relationship, and it includes more than physical violence. It includes sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression. It can be a single episode or a chronic pattern over time. A chronic pattern is where the danger can become invisible. It is where people normalize what should never be normal. This is where the concept of coercive control matters. Researchers like Evan Stark describe coercive control as a pattern of domination that can include intimidation, isolation, threats, surveillance, and rules that strip a partner of autonomy. It is not only about what happens during a violent incident. It is about what a person is kept from doing, who they are kept from seeing, and what choices they are no longer allowed to make without consequence. That kind of control can exist even when no one in the outside world sees a black eye. It can exist in calendars and passwords and money. It can exist in fear that is quiet enough to be mistaken for peace. It can exist in a partner learning to shrink their life to avoid triggering rage. When a relationship reaches a breaking point, coercive control can become more dangerous because separation threatens the controller's entire worldview. Estrangement is not just a change in status. It can be experienced as a loss of ownership. The NIJ discussion of murder-suicide in families includes estrangement as a recurring factor in these tragedies. The phrase matters because it names the moment when a person tries to leave. The moment when a person tries to reclaim autonomy. The moment when a person who needs control feels it slipping away. This is where the public tends to misunderstand risk factors. A risk factor is not a prediction. It is not a sentence. It is a signal that the probability of lethal violence can increase under certain conditions. A risk factor is also not an excuse. It explains nothing that should be forgiven. It only explains what the system should take seriously. Researchers also try to classify these crimes, not to make them orderly, but to recognize the recurring narratives offenders tell themselves. One taxonomy proposed for family annihilators describes 4 overlapping types. The self-righteous type frames the partner as the guilty party and the killings as punishment. The disappointed type believes the family failed to live up to an ideal. The anomic type treats the family as part of personal status and reacts to collapse as if the family has become surplus. The paranoid type claims the killings were protection from an external threat. The categories are not destiny. They are not a checklist. They are a way to hear the logic offenders use to justify what cannot be justified. The most important detail in these typologies is not the label. It is the recurring theme. Entitlement, ownership, control. A man deciding the family cannot exist without him, or cannot exist outside his rules, or cannot exist in a future he did not choose. This is why the why question is so dangerous when it is asked in the wrong spirit. If the question is asked to prevent violence, it can lead to better recognition of patterns and better institutional response. If the question is asked to satisfy curiosity, it can become a market for explanation that never ends. In the Watts case, the market for explanation is endless because the archive is endless. The audience has texts to read and footage to replay. The audience mistakes proximity for authority. They believe that reading private messages makes them qualified to judge the victim as if she were a character and not a person. That behavior is one reason family annihilation stories are uniquely corrosive. They invite people to turn a household into a case study. They invite people to believe they can locate the turning point in a sentence, as if one sentence caused the murders. They invite people to blame the victim for failing to detect what the public only sees clearly after the fact. Research does not support that kind of certainty. Research says the paper trail is often thin. Research says warning signs can exist without arrests. Research says lethal violence can emerge from relationships that look normal from the outside. So the honest answer to why is not a single motive. It is a structure. It is a person who cannot accept a future where he does not control the narrative. It is a person willing to destroy lives rather than lose ownership. It is a person who chooses annihilation over accountability. That structure is hard to accept because it offers no neat solution. It offers vigilance and support systems. It offers better recognition of coercive patterns. It offers institutions taking threats seriously before they become funerals. It also offers a final discomfort. You can do everything right and still be harmed by someone else's decision. That is what the public is really trying to escape when it asks why. It is trying to escape randomness. It is trying to believe tragedy is preventable if you are smart enough. Research can help reduce risk. It cannot promise safety. And that is why this case continues to haunt people. Because it forces a truth that no one wants to carry. Sometimes the warning is not a scream. Sometimes the warning is the quiet, incremental tightening of control. Sometimes the warning is a relationship becoming a cage, while the outside world still calls it a home. When a case like this becomes famous, people start searching for the moment it could have been stopped. They want a single warning sign that would have made the ending impossible. They want a clean fork in the road, where the right decision would have changed everything. Real life does not give clean forks. It gives accumulation. The research on familicide and murder-suicide in families keeps returning to the same pattern. A relationship is deteriorating. Control is tightening. Threats are increasing in specificity. A partner is trying to leave or is perceived as leaving. and access to lethal means turns a private crisis into a permanent outcome. The most unsettling part is that this pattern can exist while the outside world sees normal. A job, a neighborhood, a family photo, a man who looks calm enough to speak on a front lawn while his lies are still warm. In the Watts case, the public fixates on the affair because it is visible and easy to understand. But visibility is not the same thing as causation. An affair can be a trigger. It can also be an excuse the public clings to because it makes the story feel simple. Research is less interested in the trigger than in the structure. The structure is control meeting collapse. The structure is entitlement meeting separation. The structure is a person who cannot accept a future where he does not own the narrative. That structure often shows itself in behavior that is not always labeled violence. It can be surveillance. It can be isolation. It can be intimidation. It can be psychological aggression designed to make a partner doubt herself and shrink her world. It can be rules that turn a home into a monitored space. The CDC describes intimate partner violence as more than physical assault. It includes psychological aggression and stalking and other forms of coercion. That definition matters because it reframes what danger looks like. Danger is not only bruises. Danger can be control. Control is what makes leaving the most dangerous moment. When a controlling partner senses abandonment, the threat is not only emotional. It is existential to the identity he built. If he cannot control the relationship, he tries to control the ending. This is one reason researchers keep naming estrangement as a recurring factor in murder-suicide and familicide cases. Estrangement is not just a breakup. It is a rupture of ownership. Another recurring factor is threats, especially threats that become more specific over time. A vague threat is a signal. A specific threat is a plan in formation. Another recurring factor is access to a gun. Access does not create the desire to dominate, but it can make the final act fast, irreversible, and devastatingly efficient. When a crisis is paired with immediate lethality, the window for intervention narrows. The public often asks why there was not a clear paper trail. Research offers an answer that is uncomfortable. Many perpetrators do not look dangerous in formal records. In some studies, prior intimate partner violence was uncovered through interviews with family and friends rather than arrests. The violence existed, but the system had less documentation than the reality deserved. This is where prevention becomes a system problem, not only an individual problem. A family member can sense something is wrong, but not know how to name it. A friend can see jealousy and control, but not know the risk curve. A neighbor can hear arguments and still believe it is not their place. A workplace can see stress and still miss the meaning of escalation. So researchers and practitioners built tools designed for one purpose: to identify high-risk situations before the obituary. The danger assessment is one of the best-known lethality risk assessment tools for intimate partner violence. Law enforcement agencies also use programs like the Lethality Assessment Program, where responding officers ask a brief set of questions designed to identify victims at high danger and connect them immediately to domestic violence services. These tools exist because intuition is unreliable. People normalize what they live inside. People minimize because admitting danger is terrifying. People stay because leaving is complicated, and leaving can be the most dangerous step. Safety planning is not a slogan. It is a set of choices made under constraint. It can include who knows, where documents are kept, how communication is handled, how to avoid escalating risk while preparing to move. That is why the National Domestic Violence Hotline warns that internet usage can be monitored and that browsing is not always safe. The system is acknowledging a modern reality. Control can be digital. It can be silent. It can be invisible in public. The lesson is not that every troubled relationship leads to murder. The lesson is that certain combinations raise the risk. Control plus separation. Threats plus specificity. Violence history plus access to lethal means. Escalation plus isolation. A person who talks like a victim while behaving like an owner. When the public watches the Watts case, they often focus on the interrogation and the confession and the sentence. Those moments feel like resolution. They are not prevention. They are aftermath. Prevention is quieter. It is a friend taking a controlling pattern seriously. It is a workplace giving someone space to get help. It is law enforcement using lethality screening and connecting a victim to services instead of leaving her alone after an incident. It is a community refusing to treat domestic abuse as private drama. It is the decision to believe that psychological aggression and coercive behavior are not normal, not romantic, and not harmless. This is why the why question will never be fully satisfied. Because the real answer is not one motive. The real answer is a pattern of domination that can intensify when the abuser feels his grip slipping. And that is the deepest horror of this case. Not only what happened, but how ordinary the surface looked until it was too late. If there is any value in retelling it, it is not in turning grief into entertainment. It is in learning what the surface can hide. It is in recognizing that control is not love. It is in remembering that leaving is a critical moment that deserves support, planning, and protection. A family annihilation is not a mystery once it happens. It is a failure of recognition before it happens. And recognition is the only place where the ending can still be changed.